Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Desi from Clean Air Partnership, and with me on the call today are Amanda and Jill. They will introduce themselves shortly. They're from City of Calgary, and we are going to hear more about the efforts that City of Calgary is taking in adaptation and resilience implementation. This webinar is part of our Climate Governance, Accountability, and Implementation series that the Clean Air Partnership and our program Clean Air Council is pursuing for the last 2 months. I wanted to start with land acknowledgement. Clean Air Partnership is Toronto-based organization, and we acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. In the next 1 minute, I just wanted to show to you a short video where we can learn a little bit more about the meaning of growing long hair as an Indigenous people.
Our hair is seen as like an extension of our spirit. So we believe what makes us human beings is we have four parts. You know, we have our mind, we have our body, we have our spirit, and we have our heart. And so we almost view our hair on our head like an extension of that spiritual part of us, as opposed to just being something that grows off of our body. And the reason that we braid it into these three strands is because we believe that when we braid our hair and braid our spirit into those three strands, it's actually honoring and representing very important parts of ourself. So things like our mind, our body, and our spirit. Those three strands that we braid together are also recognized and seen as being our past, our present, and our future. These three strands also represent those before us, ourselves, and those after us. So those previous generations, ourselves, and those future generations. And those are often described as what we call our seven generations. Our hair is seen as like an extension of our spirit. So we believe.
We'll stop it here and continue with our presentation. But this is Zanong. He is based here in Ontario, and I'm learning all the time more about their culture through his videos. If you want to check it out. And before we start the presentation, I just wanted to kind of like remind you or introduce, if you haven't seen, two tools that we have at Clean Air Partnership. One is the Climate Policy Database that tracks climate-related policies across the CAC municipalities. And the other one is the Climate Action Atlas that tracks implemented ambitious mitigation projects and goes beyond CAC municipalities. We actually featured some leading practices from municipalities across Canada. I will share a link to them shortly in the chat. Lastly, our last event for the 2023, it's a webinar that we're gonna have in December. At December 13 at 1 p.m., we are going to talk about barriers to implementation, what prevents municipalities from building more complete streets and Vision Zero infrastructure. This was a research that was done by one of our programs, the Center for Active Transportation, and we're going to hear more about their findings. I'm going to share a link to our newsletter where you can stay in touch of what's coming up, as well as to our CAP events if you want to register for the event. But now, without further ado, I would like to pass it away to Jillian and Amanda from City of Calgary.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. If you can't, maybe just pop something in the chat so that Desi can know, and then she can unmute herself and interrupt me where necessary. So first, I just want to say good morning to everybody. I'd like to, well, I think for you it's afternoon, for us it's the morning. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and coming along with this journey as we talk about Calgary's experiences with implementing our Climate Adaptation Action Plan. If you attended our seminar that we did back in October, you would have already gotten my introduction. But I'm Amanda Burke. I'm from the city of Calgary, and I work on the climate governance and reporting team at the city. Today with me, I have Jillian Prosser, the leader for climate adaptation at the city of Calgary, who will be presenting with me today, probably presenting the lion's share of the slides today, as this is her area of expertise. A little bit about me. I worked at the city of Calgary for 7 years, about 4 of which I've spent working on the climate team, developing and then later reporting on Calgary's climate strategy, Pathways to 2050, including the Climate Adaptation Action Plan that is embedded within the strategy. And then prior to that, I spent about 8 years working in public service and private consulting as an environmental planner and strategist. I have a master's degree in environment and sustainability from the University of Saskatchewan, environmental professional designation in natural resource management and communications. And I'm also an alumni of the Global Institute for Water Security. So that's just kind of my background in a nutshell. I'm going to let Jill introduce herself briefly, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to get my slideshow ready. So Jill, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit to everyone?
Good morning, I'm Jill Prosser. I'm currently, as Amanda said, leading the Climate Adaptation Team. We're a great team of close to a dozen people now. We work through kind of 4 different systems of focus in the adaptation team, and we'll get into that as we go through the presentation. We're a multidisciplinary team. We have atmospheric scientists, economists, planners, biologists, engineers, kind of a full multi-spectrum group as we work on climate adaptation. I'm a professional biologist. I'm working on a Master's of Science in Environmental Management, and my background is environmental science and biology. I also have a land use planning designation. So we come together to try and work from sort of an all systems approach across the corporation, addressing the different facets of climate adaptation and building that into our overall adaptation action plan, as well as our broader climate strategy. Go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks, Jill. I'll just note that our contact information will be provided at the end of the presentation if anyone wants to reach out to us. And I'm going to ask that everyone just hold your questions until the end of the presentation. We will address them at that point. We've definitely left time for some questions at the end. And with that, I'm going to get my presentation started here. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. If not, I'm sure Desi will interrupt me. So today we're going to talk about how we are implementing our Climate Adaptation Action Plan. We are going to talk about how what the plan is about, and then how we're moving from that plan into action. And we'll talk about various projects and programs we have to action on that plan through the different themes of that plan, which includes programs around people and communities, our built infrastructure, our natural infrastructure, and water. And then we're going to talk just a little bit about how we're measuring progress on climate adaptation and resilience to climate change. And I will also speak a little bit again to funding adaptation work, because I think that's of particular interest to some of you. So I will start off by talking about the action plan a little bit, and then Jill will go into more details. So first, I'm going to talk about kind of the overall strategy. So the City of Calgary's Climate Adaptation Action Plan is embedded within the Calgary Climate Strategy, which is our Pathways to 2050, which was approved by City Council in 2022. And that was just a few months after Council declared a climate emergency for Calgary. The plan includes actions to reduce the impacts of climate change on Calgary's people, infrastructure, building, natural areas, natural resources, and services. The Adaptation Action Plan, is one of 2 action plans within the overall strategy. So one being the Adaptation Action Plan and the other being the Mitigation Action Plan, which includes actions to reduce Calgary's contributions to climate change by reducing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's kind of 2 halves of the same body of work. The slide here just outlines the vision, principles, and goals and theme areas of the climate strategy. It is available online at the link below there. You can see in the slide if you ever want to get into the details of it. The parts that we're going to walk through today a little bit are just what the adaptation side of that plan is. And I will also mention that in addition to the 2 embedded action plans within the strategy, we also have what we call the Climate Implementation Plan. And the Climate Implementation Plan essentially takes the longer term strategy and action plans, which kind of go out to about 2030, and it breaks them down into those things that we have funded in our current budget and are moving forward with in our current budget cycle. So our 2023 to 2026 budget cycle, and that aligns with our service plans and budgets that get approved by council every 4 years. So that way it takes this longer term thing and it breaks it down into 4-year chunks. And right now we're currently working on the 2023 to 2026 implementation plan. But essentially it's just sort of a shortened version of what we actually have in the full strategy, including its action plans. So I'll talk a little bit about the adaptation action plan, and then I'll turn it over to Jill to kind of get into detail on how we're actioning. So the Climate Adaptation Action Plan, it addresses both climate adaptation and climate resilience. It is separated into 4 distinct themes, each of which represent a major recipient of climate impacts. So we talk about programs or projects or actions that involve people. So that includes impacts to both people and communities. And when we say communities, we mean both geographical, as in physical boundary communities, but also communities of people, which might be defined culturally or demographically. The plan also speaks to built infrastructure. So it addresses climate impacts on built infrastructure, such as roads, buildings, bridges, and utilities, how we are building and retrofitting that infrastructure, and how we're making it more resilient to climate change impacts. It talks about natural infrastructure, which includes both natural areas as well as man-made natural features, which are impacted by climate change, but also which support climate mitigation as well. And the plan speaks to water as a critical natural resource that we rely on and that we need to protect in our changing climate. I don't know if there's anything on this slide in particular Jill you wanted to speak to, or if you want me to just move to the next one.
I would just note one final thing on this one. In Calgary, I should say in the Calgary Climate Adaptation Team language, we refer to adaptation as the processes and actions that are moving us towards climate resilience. That's really the breakdown of how we are using the language and sort of the intent behind it, so that we can see the process of adaptation resulting ideally in resilience. That's all I'll add on this slide.
Thanks, Jill. I'll just move to the next one for you here.
Perfect. Click again. Oh, there's all sorts of, okay. As Amanda figures out the clicking, I'm not sure what's going to be animated. So I'll speak to a couple examples from each of our theme areas in the action plan and how we have woven the pieces from planning to implementation. So these are just action lists provided more for your knowledge than for anything else. And a key focus in our people theme, as Amanda said, is reducing vulnerability to communities, both geographic communities, but in particular, the communities of vulnerable persons who are most at risk from the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. One of the baselining sets of information that we have used in developing our people theme area is the Community Climate Risk Index. We worked with a consultant in 2020, 2021 to develop the Community Climate Risk Index using examples from across Canada and North America to take different parameters of climate risk from the hazard-based look at exposure and what we see as happening in the city as we move forward, to looking at where our systems, our social systems, our built infrastructure, our natural assets can interact with those hazards, and where our most vulnerable community members are and our most vulnerable infrastructure assets are. So this results in something that comes out as a community climate risk score. And this score ranks essentially communities across Calgary so that we can recognize which areas may need additional support in order to address some of the climate challenges that we see now, but certainly coming in the future. It highlights some of the potential interventions that could be made at different phases, whether it's in a local area planning process or whether it's something that comes with capital planning and infrastructure investment. So one thing that we really note is that we have different sensitivities in different areas of the city for different reasons. And we have different sources of information. Next slide, Amanda. One of the other sources of information we use to build out this understanding of community risk is our urban heat analysis. We worked with a consulting team and a Microsoft for Earth grant to develop an initial urban heat mapping sort of database. And we're working internally. We should have it produced for public consumption in early 2024 to really start to understand how heat changes across the city and how that perception of heat may be different in different areas. As I said, this ties into community climate risk as one of our key risk factors is extreme heat and warming temperatures. Calgary is not generally set up with a lot of air conditioning. Many of our homes do not have any type of cooling, including multifamily, particularly older residential. So we see all of these factors as really critical to understanding our background's community climate risk. One piece of work that we're doing to try and address this risk as we move into implementation, we have this year, just this fall, brought together a group of individuals from across Calgary's most at-risk communities. So we have a working group, the Climate Resilient Communities Working Group, who have been brought together through a selection and interview or like an application and selection process to work with our city subject matter experts to better understand what they are experiencing as climate risks, as climate impacts, and to build some capacity to manage those impacts better. So it's a co-learning experience between the city, between members of the working group, many of whom are representing their broader communities, whether it's new immigrants from a particular area, whether it's elderly persons, whether it's other sort of vulnerable groups. And with this program, with this working group, next year in 2024, we will be putting forward a grant program so that these community groups, of which these members may represent, as well as other community groups, other community associations, schools, could apply to have a community climate action grant awarded to them to implement an on-the-ground project in their area. So this is one of the ways where we're tying that understanding of increased climate risk through this kind of baseline and background information stage that's really data intensive, incorporating that community focus and that community input so that we better understand what people are needing and moving forward into on the ground action. We have funding for the next 3 years to implement some on the ground actions, and we're hoping for some matching funding from one of the federal grants so that we can increase the amount of on the ground projects that we could implement. So that's what I'll say in the people theme area. We will jump to built infrastructure next. One of the key things that we're looking at in our built infrastructure, it's our first focus is on city-owned infrastructure. Our second focus is on private homes and buildings, which are the bulk of people's capital and people's investments and people's homes and livelihoods to some degree. And with our third focus is supporting climate resilient utility services. So some of the items that we're working closely on in this sort of initial year of our climate action plan, this climate action plan, I should say. Next slide, please. Is better understanding climate risk and completing resilience assessments on our corporate infrastructure projects. So in working very closely with some of the climate risk institutes and using PIBC protocol as our basis, We've really started to use this climate risk and resilience assessment process at the City of Calgary on a kind of substantial basis. We've done, I believe, close to 20 over the last 2 years now for major capital projects, for retrofit projects, for public Main Street and redesign projects. We will have available very shortly on our website our process kind of guidance document for both our full-scale risk and resilience assessments as well as our smaller scale climate risk screening assessments, which is something that we're piloting. The City of Vancouver was good enough to share their tool with us. We've made some tweaks for our context, for our risks, and our ability to sort of follow the process. So we will have that as a new tool for next year with our project managers. We have a team of people that support this work. Part of it is tied to our sustainable building policy, which is also undergoing updates and will be re-released in 2024 with updates to the sustainable building policy and the sustainable building guidance document. Both of those will also be available online. And that really starts to bring together the concept of understanding climate risk and implementing adaptation actions to build climate resilience in our built infrastructure. So while we may not be at a place where we can require above building code for all things that would support adaptation, we are becoming more able to implement adaptation measures in our own buildings and recommend it for partnership projects, as well as major private infrastructure projects with willing participants. So we do walk through this assessment process with project teams. It's very collaborative. We tend to bring together a large group of stakeholders from the project management, project design, ownership groups, operations staff, and user groups at the end. So we try and facilitate having the right people in the room to understand the kind of critical pinch points or impacts that have occurred, build that understanding of what could occur, and start to put in some of the adaptation measures into the design process itself to move things forward to build better. In coordination, let me just check the next slide. Yeah, let's look at the next slide. We have worked with our integrated risk management team to build sort of a shared understanding of climate risk and sensitivity as we work through these assessments. Over the past year, we've had some of our own learnings and we've built out some even more fulsome understanding of risk from both an asset, an environment, and a human perspective. And so it's been an iterative process of learning and improving. And that's when we release the new guidance document, that becomes clear as you see kind of where things started 2 years ago and where we've gotten to now. Next slide, please. I do want to emphasize it's not just an assessment process. So we walk through this as an assessment and as a design decision-making tool. As we work towards more implementation, we are really fortunate in this last budget cycle to be approved for a centralized climate fund. So this is the first go at the climate team, in particular, supporting capital projects in a really tangible manner to implement climate measures. So it's a shared fund of close to $30 million over this 4-year budget cycle, supporting both mitigation, greenhouse gas reductions, adaptation, and national infrastructure in building that climate resilience. So we have just closed our first intake process under that fund. We'll be screening projects over the next month. So far, we've had about double the interest for the value of capital funds that we have to distribute, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing to see that there is enough uptake to make this a worthwhile process. And what we're really hoping to be able to do is to distribute all of the capital funds to add that climate benefit piece onto capital projects where budgets were approved pre-climate strategy, pre-2022, and they are constrained in implementing climate actions due to budgets. In the case of budget shortfalls and inflation and all of these things, we do recognize that most often the items that get value managed out are climate and environmental items, because they can be removed without demonstrable removal of service delivery to the community in the perspective of many project managers. So we have the centralized climate fund now that we're hoping can sort of alleviate some of the barriers to implementing climate measures on the ground in our infrastructure right now. The hope with the fund is either that it grows so we can do more, or it goes away in the next budget process, but projects understand that climate measures need to be added to their budgets from the beginning. So we don't know yet how this will play out, but so far we're very hopeful. We've seen some really good projects come in through this application process. And like I said, about double the requests than the funds we have. So we'll be doing some screening this month. But this is sort of the outcome. We do a process, an assessment process. We see the risk areas. We develop adaptation measures. Project manager says, we don't have funding, we can't do it. And we say, look, here's some funding. Let's see if we can support you in on the ground implementation right now to build our infrastructure better right now. Next slide, please. All right, the third theme area, and this is my personal favorite, being a biologist, this is where I started with the city, was kind of managing this theme area and the work within it. Natural infrastructure is a really critical component for all kinds of reasons at the city, not just for managing climate risk, but for improving livability and aesthetics and mental health and all of the pieces that we receive from natural infrastructure. So we've recognized that we manage our natural areas through different business units, through different perspectives for different purposes, and we are trying to build a better understanding of how it all works together as a connected network of infrastructure that provides a lot of benefits from ecosystem services to climate resilience benefits. These are all built into what we get from our natural infrastructure across the city. Next slide, please. In the 2020 update to the municipal development plan, we were able to integrate that concept of natural infrastructure and start to raise it at an MDP level at the city. We are in the midst of an MDP update, revision, rewrite right now. We will have a new municipal development plan for the city of Calgary by the end of next year. And so we'll see how this shifts, what's integrated into the next one, but we do have this now built in as a key component and idea at the city of Calgary. We look at natural infrastructure as a spectrum from our natural areas and natural assets, our large grassland parks like Nose Hill, forested areas along the rivers, our wetlands and constructed wetlands. And then as we get into the more engineered assets, the green stormwater infrastructure, we've worked closely with our new stormwater strategy and implementation team to build a better understanding of how green stormwater infrastructure assets are really, truly multi-beneficial solutions for a lot of climate challenges and a lot of municipal challenges that we see in the city of Calgary. Next slide, please. We recognize that we can deliver city services through sort of a single lens perspective, or we can deliver them through a multi-beneficial approach. That's really what we understand more closely with natural infrastructure. The background photo here is an old gravel pit. It was a brownfield site on the edge of the Bow River, coming down off of the development on the top of the slope that's on the my right-hand side of the screen. So this area for many, many years was kind of a contaminated brownfield old gravel pit site. There was an approach taken through a multidisciplinary team and a lot of effort on a lot of people's behalf to manage stormwater coming down off the development, to develop a recreational space, to create habitat and biodiversity opportunities in this old gravel pit site. And so this is Dale Hodges Park is the name of it in Calgary. And it's now kind of a feature park in the city. It does a tremendous amount of stormwater management and water quality improvement from areas which used to have basically completely untreated stormwater entering into the Bow River. So this is a large system of hybrid infrastructure. There's a lot of engineering involved in this one. There are maintenance requirements and operational upkeep, but it provides a really positive recreational space. It provides opportunities for, like I said, the water quality management, water quantity, retention. It provides and just an overall increase in benefit in that area. So we really are starting to better understand and use natural infrastructure to approach our city service delivery. Next slide, please. One of the ways that we're working from a planning perspective, we completed a natural asset inventory a couple of years ago, bringing together data sets from a number of different operational units: water resources, water services, parks, recreation, transportation. Everyone has little data sets that build up together to be kind of our natural infrastructure network across the city. So this was a first step in building that. We've used this inventory now as an overlay with our environmentally significant areas mapping so that we can start to see how they all interconnect. And we will be using both of these tools and both of these pieces to build out our environmental reserve and conservation reserve policy as we are in this MDP update. So again, it's this baseline planning that can lead to implementation and policy change and changing decisions at sort of the land use planning and ideally at the operational level as well. Next slide, please. As we completed the natural asset valuation, we looked at 6 key ecosystem service areas, from recreation, amenity, habitat provision, water retention, urban heat reduction, and carbon storage. And we recognized that the natural assets across the city have a replacement cost of close to $7 billion and an annual service value of $2.5 billion. So we went through quite an extensive technical project with a team of consultants, Green Analytics and Associated Engineering, and they helped to build this understanding that natural assets provide services that have value, and we need to do better to understand that value at all stages of the land use planning, the operational decision making, and sort of our overall city building process. So this is, again, one of these key planning components that we are leveraging as we enter implementation. Next slide. Some of our key implementation projects have been building or improving natural areas across the city. We've been piloting some mini forest methods in a few different areas in Northeast Calgary, which are traditionally sort of underserved by tree canopy. The area is historically native prairie. It would have been a native prairie, dry prairie landscape. So there are some geological and soil challenges to tree canopy. There are also land use planning decisions that have resulted in very low tree canopy coverage across those areas. And so we're testing some different processes to try and build up that canopy in the best way that we can. We have different projects around habitat restoration and naturalization to support pollinators and native species. And we've got projects around rain gardens and bioretention. A lot of these pieces are sort of all coming together in 2024, where we'll have sort of more energy and more funding, capital, and operationally to deliver on more of these types of projects across the city. Next slide. Because really we understand that there are different concepts of value. And when we look at this picture, I like to ask, what has value in this picture? As a municipality, the bench and the viewing platform are assigned values as tangible capital assets, or as assets in our asset management charts and tables. What we have not traditionally assigned value to are the slopes and the trees and the forests and the grasslands and the walking paths that weave along our riverbanks and our special areas. So that's the intent of these types of programs, is to better understand value. Next slide, please. We'll take a quick tour of the water theme. As most of you probably know, Calgary had a very, very expensive flood in 2013. We just finished our 10-year, I don't know if anniversary, a commemoration of 10 years of the flood is the words that were used. Understanding that we've come a long way in managing flood. We are better understanding drought, unfortunately, than we ever have. And we're working to improve our upstream watershed management and cooperation with our upstream watershed management partners. So that's where this action or this theme area comes into play, is actions all around our water. Next slide. As I mentioned, Calgary's floods, we saw some $6+ billion in insurable damages with the floods in 2013. We have reduced that risk by over 55% in the city. A lot of that is along the Elbow River. There is still remaining flood risk along the Bow River, but there has been a tremendous amount of flood risk reduction along the Bow River as well. And there are significant investments in both upstream solutions, sort of local and regional solutions, such as these two kind of barrier projects. The top image is the Eau Claire flood barrier, which is along downtown Calgary, that provides an increased level of flood resilience along our downtown core. And the second photo is of the Glenmore Reservoir Dam, which has had an increased amount of storage as they change the height of where the dam gates sit, so we can hold back more floodwater. Along with these kinds of physical measures, there have been significant changes in operational discussions around dam management upstream of Calgary, and there have been site-specific measures taken in some areas as well. Next slide, please. The opposite, to some degree, of flood is drought, and Calgary approved its drought resilience plan this year at council. We also had drought water conservation restrictions in place to manage our drought conditions this summer for the first time ever. So Calgary has a multi-step drought management process in place so that we understand which stage of drought will relate to what kind of water shortage restrictions. Although we've seen our annual water demand decrease despite a growing population, we still see some real pinch points of water use. Our high demand days, our high heat days, our low summer flows, all of these pieces sort of play together to remind us that we really need to be careful stewards of Calgary's water and our watersheds, and working through this drought resilience planning process and building about a better understanding both with the public and with our own utility has been a key implementation piece of this past year. Go ahead, Amanda. I think it's your slides from now on.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up briefly and just talk a little bit about how we're measuring climate adaptation progress and success, as well as I'll talk just a little bit about funding, and then maybe if there's more specific questions, we can answer those. So just to talk really briefly about how we report. So we report through what we call the Climate Reporting Framework, which is, it's our fancy way of saying it's a group of different reporting processes that we use to report on our progress and success around climate change. And so this reporting framework includes 3 sort of flagship reports on Calgary's progress on climate change. One, which comes in March, is the Corporate Performance Report, which is for all city services, including our climate and environmental management line of service. And that report includes a summary of budget spend, as well as key performance metrics, including those on climate change. That's followed shortly by the financial report in April, which includes a section on climate-related financial disclosures, which is specific, again, to sort of risk and spent expenditures on climate-related finances. And then the third is our annual or biannual climate progress report, which details the city's progress on climate action as we have committed to in the climate implementation plan, which again is our 4-year service plan for delivering on the climate strategy. And so The Climate Progress Report basically details our progress on those specific actions, as well as supporting metrics and information that we provide. And that is a physical report that actually goes to council, but then it's also going to be supported by an online dashboard, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. And just noting here that those two things work in tandem. So the Climate Progress Report will speak specifically to actions we have taken, while the dashboard will speak specifically to how we're measuring that progress on those, as well as success on our performance measures through an online portal that is metric driven as opposed to, say, action driven. In the future, we're also currently developing ESG reporting as well. We're still in the scoping process of determining what that looks like and how it works with our climate-related financial disclosures in our finance report, because those two things tend to kind of work in tandem. So that's just something that we're currently developing, and you know, I'm not sure when the first ESG report would come out, potentially in either late 2024 or 2025 is the current plan. But just to speak a little bit about that dashboard I mentioned. So as part of our reporting, we're developing sort of a data management, data warehousing, analytics, as well as a citizen dashboard set of tools, which we call the Climate and Environment Analytics Project. The product will be an online data analysis and advanced analytics platform, providing our staff as well as the public a set of tools to facilitate both analysis, but also understanding in terms of our climate and environmental monitoring, reporting, and forecasting. This is going to really transform how we manage and share climate and environmental data. And the online version of this, or the online portal to this, will be a public-facing dashboard. Oh, doesn't want to advance. There we go. And essentially, the purpose of developing the platform, the analytical platform, as well as the dashboard, is to deliver relevant and actionable climate and environmental information, insight, and recommendations in a consistent, coordinated, and integrated way. So it's going to be a very powerful tool for both analytics as well as sharing information to the public. That dashboard will be launched about halfway through 2024 and will come out around the same time as our next climate progress report so that they can complement each other. In the meantime, we have an interim climate dashboard that's already available on calgary.ca. You can see the URL on the bottom of this slide. And that climate dashboard provides sort of a snapshot of different climate metrics that kind of expand the breadth of both our mitigation and adaptation work. And on that, we have a bit of a self-assessment as to whether or not we're on track to achieve our goals and targets under the climate strategy. We kind of do a bit of a self-assessment, as well as explain each of those metrics in a sort of plain language, public-friendly way, and as well as sort of explain why these metrics are important and why do they matter. So you can go right now and find that available online, and that includes both, like as I mentioned, mitigation and adaptation metrics. I'm going to talk just a little bit about organizational realignment. I'll get through this quick because I know we want time for questions. Essentially, the important thing to note here is that our structure around climate adaptation is a little bit different than some municipalities, in the sense that we've essentially combined our climate adaptation team along with other natural environment related teams, so that the work around natural infrastructure is complemented by teams that are working on different program areas involving natural resources and natural infrastructure. If you have questions on this, you can talk specifically maybe to Jill about how that's working for us. But essentially, it's to bring those kind of two streams of work into alignment, and it's a little bit different. But we also, of course, have our climate mitigation team, which is within one of our divisions of our business unit. Just to talk very briefly about funding, I think that the takeaway from this slide essentially is that the way we've approached funding climate adaptation work is to combine our funding asks under sort of categories of budget requests that involve the thing, sort of the process that we're trying to take advantage of, or the thing we're trying to influence, as opposed to presenting a climate mitigation and a climate adaptation budget separately. And then, because that can kind of create competition between those two requests for funding. So instead, we've rolled them up into these, what we call focus areas. And those focus areas include actions to address both climate mitigation and adaptation. So, if we're looking at mobility and we're looking at programs around, say, buses, or if we're looking at buildings and we're looking at programs that involve how we build better or how we retrofit buildings, they will look at aspects of those programs that relate to both climate mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And that way we don't create internal competition for our funding resources. Again, if you have more specific questions on that, I can try to answer them. I'm not the funding guru, but I will do my best to answer them. And that's essentially all we wanted to talk about. I wanted to leave some time for questions. And on this slide, of course, is our contact information to follow up with us afterwards. I'll turn it back to Desi to see if there's any specific questions you'd like us to answer. I have tried to address a couple in the Q&A. And I think Jill's probably having a look through there as well right now.
Yes, thank you very much, Jill and Amanda, for the presentation. It seems that Calgary is really taking this like data governance and digital strategy approach of like taking the data to inform policies, which is great. And I'm sure that you mentioned a couple of times that this is coming up next year, kind of. So I'm sure we're going to follow up. Yes, there are a lot of questions. Thank you so much for addressing some of them. I'm going to start right away with some, and Jill, I see that you're responding to one of that. I don't know if you want to continue writing or if you want to speak up to that. And it's a bunch of the questions that are regards into the centralized climate fund. So the 30 million fund for climate projects, how do you prioritize what to be spent on? Jill, I know that you're just typing it, but it is going to be interesting because there was another question similar to that as well.
Exactly. So I thought I would give a little more information on that. Unfortunately, because it is an internal fund and application process, we haven't made external links, but I do have an application package that I can share. I think with this group, there's nothing confidential by any means, but we do have some obviously eligibility and evaluation criteria. Our number one piece is that the funding request must be for an incremental capital fund increase for an existing fully funded capital project. So you must have a project, it must be funded, and it must be moving forward in this budget cycle. So that's our kind of number one piece. Secondly, your project has to align with one of the subcategories of low carbon built infrastructure. So that's that greenhouse gas reduction, climate resilient built infrastructure, or climate resilient natural infrastructure. So the incremental capital funds that you are asking for must fit in one of those categories. We cannot, under the terms that the budget was approved, buy electric vehicles with this fund. That's one category that we are not able to support. But otherwise, if your project request fits into that low carbon built, climate resilient built, or climate resilient natural infrastructure, you may have an eligible project. Projects must be funded, owned, managed, or a majority owned by the City of Calgary or a civic partner. So we have some terms that are pretty specific to our funding and ownership structures of different buildings and facilities and sites at the city. The funds cannot be for a position, even if it's a position to design a capital project. It must be for a capital investment itself. And then as we look at the criteria, I'll speak through the greenhouse gas. It says the project must clearly describe how emissions will be reduced, how that reduction has been quantified, and how significant that reduction is by dollar. Like, so how is sort of your ratio of emissions reductions to cost spent, as well as total potential reductions that the project could result in. So there's a few pieces, and we've got kind of a 5-stage ranking criteria for those projects. So does your project significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Some decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, or really limited or unclear mechanism of how that decrease would be achieved is kind of how we look at the mitigation projects. When we look at climate resilient built infrastructure, does the project reduce climate risk in some manner? Has a climate risk and resilience assessment or some acceptable equivalent been completed? So these are requirements that we're asking for. And is the risk to people, the infrastructure asset itself, the broader community or location, or the environment? And then again, we've got that 5-stage ranking of it's going to significantly reduce risk. There will be some risk reduction. It might reduce risk, or you know what, we really can't tell. We recognize that we are going to have to make some subjective decisions on this, but we're going to work through this process. Like I said, it's the first time. We'll learn from it. Then the third category under that climate resilient natural infrastructure, we have to understand how the project would build climate resilient outcomes through natural infrastructure. So what ecosystem services are you going to be providing or enhancing? What natural assets are you going to be providing or enhancing? And how significant would that be with respect to sort of the ecological corridor, underserved areas, things like that. The other piece we have is a 10% requirement for equity. So leveraging some of our work around the Calgary Equity Index. Is the project located in a community service area, so an area in which it's been recognized we need to improve equity? And does it support explicitly an equity denied or deserving group? We don't know how these are going to play out in our final scoring quite yet, but those are some of the key criteria.
Thank you, Joe. This was a very, thank you for the detailed explanation of how it goes. I think there is like okay, I'm going to move to questions by questions, but I think there was one that I think you answered as you were giving this answer. Talking about prioritization, how do you prioritize adaptation programs between draft, flooding, community programming in terms of funding, and how do you spend staff time?
This is a challenging one. We have, over the past decade, spent a tremendous amount of money on river flooding as one of our major hazards. And that would be due to the extensive economic losses that the city experienced. We are just starting to learn and improve some of our other sort of risk reduction areas. Right now, we have about 2 to 3 staff on each of our theme areas: people, built environment, natural environment, water. And that's just in the climate team. We have partners all across the corporation who work closely with us. What else was in that question there? Oh, it vanished.
Yeah, sorry. What's the prioritization? When do you prioritize funding community program, flooding community program?
Yeah. Community programs are traditionally underfunded in municipalities across Canada, and Calgary is no different. We are starting to do better, but it's at percentiles worth of what other major projects or major areas are funded at, and that's just the reality. We're starting to just chip away at the very kind of building blocks of it, but yeah, we're not quite there yet.
Okay, moving on to next question. In BC, municipalities are using low carbon resilience as a way of approaching mitigation and adaptation simultaneously. Is Calgary using this approach?
We are, to some degree. We recognize there are some low carbon greenhouse gas reduction methods that also build resilience, and there are some that don't. We are working, there's one program I can point to with some incentives for, they are climate mitigation incentives, that's where they're being funded through, but they're going to support ground source heat pumps, improved insulation. Those types of things build climate resilience as well as decarbonize. So we are seeing those links. We are getting better at messaging those links. And so it is something that we are working towards. In my personal opinion, from the adaptation sense, we've put a lot of effort on low carbon. We're starting to see some of the uptake, but we're still seeing a lot of existing climate risk in our community that we have not addressed yet. So I would say I'm a little hesitant to say that we want to be really closely aligned with low carbon resilience, but we do recognize there are links.
Yeah, I hear this. We have the same kind of like senses from our cities and municipalities that there is more, a little bit more done on mitigation and adaptation. It's yet to hopefully be more proactive. The next question is, have you looked at vulnerability due to a long power outage while also considering electrification? Does the city work with the electrical utility to understand how to jointly reduce vulnerability due to power outage?
It's a risk that's identified, but we don't have a mitigation measure in place, I would say, for it. We are working with NMAX. I believe I can probably say it. They are a major utility provider, and we are kind of collaborating with them as they start a multi-year process of better understanding climate risk to the utility services. So we are working with them. We're in early days still, and it'll be a couple of years. And certainly a long power outage and electrification are concerns. Even a short power outage, going any more than a couple of days or a few hours to a few days is a concern. We do have recommendations for backup generators and battery operated critical services, but those are not long-term or broader reaching solutions by any means.
Right. I think this is the question. I will read it anyway, but I think you kind of like answered in answering the first question. How is the city addressing the need for huge capital investments required in incremental costs to making the existing buildings and infrastructure resilient and adapt to climate change?
Yeah, I mean, we recognize we've got an infrastructure gap of a staggering degree as a municipality, and across the country. First, we have to understand what that gap is and what that sort of uplift requirement would be to build resilience. One piece of work that we've done that I didn't mention was we completed an economic analysis of climate risk on our facilities portfolio. So we looked at about 70% of the buildings that the City of Calgary owns, operates, manages, and looked at our key climate risks to it and our timeline over the next century for the sort of life cycle replacements and how that could be changed by climate, as well as sort of the capital impacts of failure. So if we have severe climate impacts leading to failure in building assets in some of these different facility types, what does that look like? What does that capital cost look like? So with that economic analysis, some of the outputs included a perspective on when assets should be retrofit or replaced. So things like better understanding. One example I can give is better understanding how changing our air exchange units might have to happen quicker. They may have a shorter lifespan with the increasing temperatures and increasing filtration needs with wildfire smoke. We're seeing our air exchangers being impacted. Full disclosure, I'm not an engineer nor building mechanical person. So I just am saying what this report kind of came out was that we are going to see the need for increasing life cycle and asset replacement even more than we have before. And to be honest, there are hard questions across the country about where the funding can and should come from. I think municipalities are in a really tough place, relying on the tax structures that we have and the tremendous need to provide services for the bulk of citizens in Canada, residents in Canada.
Right, and you kind of like touched one of the, by the way, Amanda, we see that you're typing something. I don't know if you would like us to see that or not. I just wanted to flag it. but I'm assuming this is an answer to one of the questions. So thank you so much for providing that. Very quickly in the last 1 minute, yeah, Jill, you touched kind of like on that, and we are all trying to understand what other mechanisms are available there for funding climate implications. It is great to see that you have that centralized climate fund, and I also, Amanda, appreciate that you touch base on how you went around to like not allow for competition between mitigation and resilience funding, as you're providing it as a kind of like a focus area. These are learnings that hopefully will hopefully soon we'll have more options available for municipalities to have funding for implementation. We are at the end. I just want to give Amanda, do you want to kind of like speak a little bit of what you just wrote? Or I know that we are at the end of the webinar, but maybe a few seconds.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just answering the question about the report that we had a consultant do for us in 2022 about the cost of inaction on climate change. And just very briefly, the question was around what was the investment that was identified and how do we plan to finance this investment? And I just wanted to say, so the investment that was identified in the report was, I think 0.26% of Calgary's GDP, which equates to about $320 million of investment per year for the next 10 years. And then that was compared to the cost of inaction, doing nothing, which was estimated at about 1.2 billion by 2055, ballooning up to 7.8 by 2080s, as of course more climate impacts start to occur. But what's important to really note about that is that that investment number identified, while it's quite large, it's not just City of Calgary investment. That investment includes all sectors of Calgary. So that includes what the city might invest as a municipality, but also like private investments that we can leverage, investments by like everyday Calgarians and their own homes and buildings, as well as like Calgary's businesses, ICI sector, and other orders of government, such as the federal government and their various programs. So we're not doing it alone. That's kind of the wholesome investment required by all sectors.
Right. Thank you so much, and thank you for answering the other questions that were in the Q&A about the climate lens and everything. We'll be summarizing what came out from this webinar, and we'll send the slide deck, some of the links that were shared, as well as a recording of this webinar. I don't want to hold anyone more and longer, but thank you so much, Jill and Amanda. This is great, and we'll be following up and seeing how all these tools and that you've shared with us are coming along in 2024. With that, I want to wish everyone a good day for the rest of the day, and stay tuned for more of our webinars and workshops. Thank you very much, Jill and Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.